In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night. Hello and welcome back, my homicidal friends. After the flusteredness that was my Last of the Living review, I have gotten some ice cream and watched an episode of Svengoolie, where I watched The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, not to be confused with The Mummy's Curse or The Mummy's Tomb. No, it's The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, which is really confusing because there's way too many mummy movies, and they all fall under the same franchise, technically, with the old Universal Mummy movies, which start with Imhotep for one movie, and then it's Kharis the Mummy for the rest, and then the Hammer films, which start with Kharis, and then you've got this movie, which is a completely different mummy from any of the other ones. So I'm lost, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to have anything to do with any of the other mummy movies. But yeah, it's a Hammer film, so it's taken a lot of cues from the old Universal movies, but amped up the gore and sex appeal pretty much. Right off the bat, at the very beginning of the movie, we get a severed hand, which I thought was going to set a precedent for what they were going to show in the film. But then later on, we get a flashback to the past where someone else's hand gets severed and they cut away from it. So I'm confused as to what all that was about. Essentially, the plot of the film is that there is a group of Egyptologists, archaeologists who go to Egypt, find a mummy, bring him back. There's this American show business guy played by Fred Clark who goes and decides to take the mummy on the road as this attraction just to make money, which totally alienates a lot of the other people working with him. Fred Clark's performance as the show business guy really carries a lot of the movie until we get to the mummy, which is not until way, way, way into the movie, because this movie is definitely a slow burn when it comes to horror. We get some murders and some mystery, but in terms of the mummy, we don't really get much of the mummy until the end of the film. But when you do get the mummy, it's definitely worth it. There are some very weird scenes. Fred Clark's character, he goes and gets this Turkish candy that he brings to the explorers and has them taste it and ask what they think of him, and one of them says delightful, and he's like, oh, delightful, that's perfect, we'll call it Turkish Delight. So there's the origin story of Turkish Delight in a mummy movie, which is really weird, and I'm sure anyone who's historically inclined is going to have a mental breakdown after watching this out of anger at all the inaccuracies in this film. But whatever. So within the framework of this, essentially, Fred Clark brings back the mummy and opens it up to a select few people to show them what he's going to be presenting to the rest of the people, and then he is going to present it to a larger crowd, and he warns them about a curse that whoever opens the sarcophagus and looks upon the face of the mummy will die, acting like he's not opened the coffin before. And when he opens it, the mummy is gone. So naturally, the mummy starts going after all of them, but that takes a little while. So regarding the cast, we've got Fred Clark playing the protagonist. No, not Fred Clark. Fred Clark's the show business guy, definitely not the protagonist. Fred Clark's character is kind of obnoxious, but in a wonderfully entertaining way. Ronald Howard, not to be confused with Ron Howard, is the main protagonist. He played Sherlock Holmes in the old 50s Sherlock Holmes TV show, which I've not seen, but no, I've seen a few episodes, but it's been a long time. I'd like to go back and look at that again, but yeah, we've got him, and the female love interest character in this movie has been in James Bond movies and some other things, but they dubbed over her voice with someone else doing a French accent. And until Svengoolie pointed it out, I did not notice. The dubbing in this movie is not noticeable at all. It's really, really good. Which I can't say for any movie I've ever seen before. Really. That I know of, unless there's some other movie that has dubbing that I don't know about, but the only movies that have dubbing are coming to mind are Japanese kaiju movies and Suspiria, all of which have not the greatest dubbing. So moving on, the score in this movie sounds familiar. It's probably reused from some other Hammer movie, but it's good music. I just could have sworn I've heard it somewhere else other than this movie before. Yeah, the movie takes a really long time to get to the mummy, and I was kind of bored through a lot of the not mummy part of this movie. Fred Clark's entertaining. There's some interesting mystery stuff, but a lot of it's not a horror movie. It's kind of a mystery drama thing, which I can somewhat appreciate, but there's a lot of love triangle and a little bit of mystery and not a lot of horror until later. And part of the mystery segment of this movie features someone knocking out Ronald Howard's protagonist, and his face isn't shown, and he's got the black gloves on, and it's very much what you'd see later on in a lot of Dario Argento movies, with the black gloved killer whose face you never see, who's in every single Dario Argento movie ever made, ever. And then you'd later see tropes like that in movies like Crimson Peak, which of course are taking from Dario Argento and Hammer and all of this stuff. So just FYI, I'm reading off of sticky notes that I was writing on haphazardly as I watched the movie, so if I'm looking down a bunch, that's why. So moving on to spoilery type things. First off, the kills in this movie are really good, considering that they show absolutely nothing. The second kill, and in particular, is extremely brutal. The mummy breaks into his room, picks up this Egyptian statue that's on his desk, and beats him over the head with it. You don't see anything, but you hear it, and it's painful and wonderful. And then later on, probably my favorite and simultaneously least favorite scene in the movie, just because it's so uncomfortable, is there's a character, his last name is Bey. There's always an Egyptian guy wearing a fez with the last name Bey in a mummy movie for some reason. Couldn't imagine why. But they've trapped the mummy in a net, and he just goes up to the mummy and starts saying that I've sinned. I want you to kill me in the most painful way you possibly can. And the mummy just rips the net away, and as this guy is bowing on the floor in front of him, the mummy stomps on his head and crushes it, and you hear him scream, and he's skull crushing, and it's horrific, which is exactly what a horror movie should be. Once the movie goes in the horror direction, it's pretty good. And it has a really interesting twist to it, because you've got a love triangle thing going on between Ronald Howard, Sherlock Holmes guy, the overdubbed James Bond lady, and some other guy who I have no idea what else he's been in, but he seems kind of shifty throughout the film. And he turns out to be the mummy's brother from a flashback, who's been alive for centuries and has stolen this amulet that brings him to life and is commanding him to kill a bunch of people. But naturally, as happens in every single one of these classic monster movies, as soon as the mummy sees the main love interest character, he freezes in his tracks and can't kill her and kills him instead. Tries to do that once and fails, and then actually does it again later. But I was expecting him to be the killer. I wasn't expecting him to be the mummy's brother, so I thought that was a good twist. So in conclusion, I think that Curse of the Mummy's Tomb is far from the best Hammer horror movie, or the best mummy movie, or the best anything in general. It's not a great movie, but it is a good movie, and I highly recommend it if you want a good classic Hammer-style horror film and you're willing to wait a while before things get going. Thank you for watching.
In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night.